much. This is the first time in Israel, and some additional value is only here too. Now, the Greek Symposion and the biblical Marzeah, contrasts and parallels. I will refer to my bibliography that somewhere circulates among you in my handouts. Let me begin by saying that my definition of the Symposion owes much to the groundbreaking works by Oswin Murray. By Symposion I mean a nocturnal wine party attended by aristocratic males, banqueting on an equal footing. To be more precise, I would depict it as an occasion in which fragile symbolic hierarchies were formed ad hoc, based on conventional symbolic grounds, usually through rivalry in cultural skills, such as reciting poetry, for instance. As to its basic social function, I would define it as the aristocratic and possibly early classical symposium as a hub or focal point of the mechanisms of natural selection of Greek aristocracy, a tool of integration of advancing kakoi, or nouveau riche, into local social elites of the aristoi in the Greek world. Now, let me quote a passage from the book of Amos. You can also find in the materials distributed beforehand. Alas for those who are at ease in Zion, and for those who feel secure on Mount Samaria, the notables of the first of the nations to whom the house of Israel resorts. Alas for those who lie on beds of ivory and lounge on their couches, and eat lambs from the flock and cows from the stall, who sing idle songs to the sound of the harp, and like David improvise on instruments of music, who drink wine from bowls, and anoint themselves with the finest oils, but are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. Therefore they shall now be the first to go into exile, and the revelry of the loungers, Marzeah here, shall pass away. The famous biblical passage offers many specific parallels between the feast of the Samaritans, recalled by Amos, and the Greek Symposium. Feasting in a reclining position, musical and vocal performances by banqueters anointed with perfumes, and, importantly, a focus on intensive wine consumption. The book of Amos most probably came into being in the mid-8th century BCE, so we have at our disposal a source that is more or less contemporary to the Cup of Nestor, the first famous and ambiguous testimony of the archaic Symposium that points to the existence of a Levantine banquet, this book of Amos passage, of a Levantine banquet very similar to the one attested by the Cup of Nestor in the Greek settlement on Pitakusai in the Gulf of Naples. In a wider Mediterranean perspective, the question naturally arises about the historical link between the two customs. And indeed, discussion revolving around the problem of the Oriental origins of the Symposium is often set off by this passage from the book of Amos. There are two ways of approaching the problem of possible connections between these two types of banquets. On the one hand, one can trace the iconography of the Middle Eastern, that is, reclining banquet, and the diffusion of its elements into the Greek world. On the other hand, we can attempt a systematic approach and compare the two types of feast using the available literary sources that refer to them. And this is the latter I will try to do today. When investigating the literary sources, we will scrutinize them for the presence of the term Marzeah, which will compel us to include text written over several millennia throughout the Middle East and even the whole Mediterranean. The two paths, the iconographical, so to say, and the literary, meet in the passage of the book of Amos, which on the one hand contains elements of convivial practice corresponding to iconographic motives in Levantine art, feasting in a reclining position, accompaniment of music and lavish surroundings, and on the other hand provides the term by which Amos designates a drinking party of this sort, Marzeah. Although only mentioned by name at one other point in the Hebrew Bible, Jeremiah 16:5, there are several testimonies suggesting this type of feast that may be compared with the Greek Symposium. That's in Jeremiah, in Isaiah, and in the Judges. The last episode, featuring the Samson's feast, does not mention the term Marzeah, but the reference to a drinking party typical of young warriors and the custom of telling convivial riddles, I will get back to this, has led some scholars to compare the Philistine banquet in the book of Judges to the Greek Symposium. The biblical passages adduced above, only referred to above, are of particular significance for our problem, as they are more or less chronologically consistent with the emergence and flourishing of the Greek Symposium. However, Near Eastern extra-biblical attestations of this institution can be observed over a period of 3,000 years. The term already appears in the second half of the 3rd millennium BCE in two texts from Ebla, in the 13th century in a ritual calendar from Emar in Syria, in more or less 1200 BCE in 9 texts from Ugarit. Then a long interval follows, filled by the aforementioned biblical passages, or the prototypes of the stories they convey before they are Deuteronomistic redaction. And later on we find the term Marzeah on a Moabite papyrus possibly from Tel Iktanu from the late 7th or early 6th century BCE, although the authenticity of this text is questioned by some scholars. In Aramaic on a Jewish ostracon from Elephantine from the 5th century BCE, on a Phoenician fiale from the beginning of the 4th century, a Phoenician inscription from the 4th or 3rd century BCE called the Tarif of Marseille, a Phoenician inscription from Piraeus from the mid-3rd century, 2 Nabatean inscriptions from the 1st century BCE from Petra and Avdat, several Parmenuine tesserae from the 1st to 3rd century of the Common Era, a few inscriptions from Palmyra dated to the period from the first decades of the Common Era to the last quarter of the 3rd century of the Common Era, a couple of rabbinic texts from the 1st centuries of the Common Era, and finally on a mosaic map from a Byzantine church in Madaba in Jordan, 6th century of the Common Era. So the dossier of the Marzeah is therefore very rich, but even setting aside the numerous problems with chronology and interpretation of individual texts, a fundamental question arises as to whether we have the right to combine information obtained from very different Near Eastern communities over a time span of 3,000 years. Now, if with Walter Burkhardt and John McLaughlin, to whom I refer in my bibliography, and some other scholars, we considered it sensible to build a minimal model or something of an ideal type, as it were, of this institution based on the aforementioned sources, and especially those predating and contemporaneous with the flourishing of the Greek Symposium, I think a solid bulk of data can be compared with the Greek Symposium, and thus we can reassess the hypothesis of the influence of the Marzeah on the Greek elite drinking systems. For his part, McLaughlin identified 3 constitutive traits of the Semitic Marzeah present, or at least implied, in most of the text throughout those periods in this text I referred to. First, excessive consumption of alcohol, that's clear. Second, elite status of the participants. And third, a religious context. These 3 traits bring to mind the Greek Symposium, but of course we all can see that we are dealing with a description so general that many other institutions and types of feasting in various societies throughout the world easily conform, so nothing specific emerges from this. Although one can point to significant changes which this institution underwent over the centuries, McLaughlin's analysis of non-biblical sources allow us to add other, more specific points to the list of key or universal features of the Marzeah. First of all, a leader. There is always, when we can see something more in our sources, a leader of this institution that is clearly present, and sometimes there are other functionaries, including a treasurer. Second, a Marzeah owned property usually, land, a vineyard, a building, as well as certain funds. And third, there is a close institutionalized connection between the Marzeah and the cult of various deities. There are also several other noteworthy aspects which McLaughlin has not sufficiently emphasized. The Marzeah indeed involves the ritual consumption of alcohol with the intention of getting drunk, but in practically all the texts that elaborate on the topic, we can see that drinking went hand in hand with the consumption of other foodstuff, particularly large amounts of the finest cuts of meat. To my knowledge, none of the sources that state that Marzeah took place in the night, and we would expect the prophetic text of the Bible, which condemned this social practice, as the Book of Amos, to stigmatize such behavior had it taken place. Thus, it seems justified to conclude that the Marzeah was organized during the day. Curiously, in a different passage from Amos, ritualized aristocratic drinking is practiced by a group of distinguished women in the society of Samaria. It therefore seems that the Marzeah may have been an institution for both males and females, though it is not at all clear if the men and women of the elite ever feasted together. In addition, the participants of the Marzeah sometimes dined in a reclining position, as in the Book of Amos, but sometimes they were evidently seated during the banquet, in some of our sources. A key parallel between the Symposion and the Marzeah is, however, the luxurious nature of both institutions, which manifested itself in the consumption of large amounts of wine, the use of perfumes, and also in the enjoyment of cultural entertainment, such as music, singing, or convivial riddles. Although these last aspects are apparent only, if I'm not mistaken, in Amos, already quoted, and in the story of Samson in Judges 12 to 14. Nevertheless, this similarity does not seem to constitute a sound argument in favor of a close historical connection between the Marzeah and the Symposium. Again, it is sufficient to recall the memorable passages of Johann Heusinger's Homo Ludens to remember that agonistic pastimes, including riddle contests, as well as slanging matches, cours d'amour, and so on, play an important role in many cultures, also, if not especially, at the table. Heavy drinking, dancing, and reciting poetry are quite obviously common elements of elite banquets in many cultures worldwide. In fact, we owe the identification of the Marzeah with the Symposium to the ancient Palmyrines, in whose bilingual inscriptions the designation of the leader of the Marzeah is translated into Greek as symposiarchos. However, this was the effect of an anachronistic usage in the time of the Roman Empire. It may be significant that the term symposium most likely denoted a hall for ritual public banquets at Palmyra. In turn, the Nabateans identified Dushara, the divine patron of one of the Marzeah at Ardat, with Dionysus, but in this case we are dealing with late tradition, which undoubtedly came into being after the region already came in contact with the Greco-Roman culture. Already at this stage of my argument, it is clear that the basic distinguishing traits of the Symposium, so rigorous separation of food and drink, nocturnal dining, and assembling in a strictly male group, were perhaps alien to the Levantine tradition that, as we can follow in our sources. In the face of these differences, I would suggest rethinking the hypothetical connection between the Symposium and the Levantine Marzeah in light of two convenient typologies of forms of banqueting elaborated by Michael Dickler and Brian Hayden, referred to in my bibliography, as well as those that are conceived by Claude Grignon. Let us begin by observing that the Marzeah was a festive occasion on the community's calendar of rituals or a religious festival, and lasted several days. We have a month of Marzeah. For instance, in the Emar calendar included a month of Marzeah, so it is a kind of period of time. The designation of the institution of Marzeah was sometimes modified by the, especially in our Ugaritan texts, by the name of the deity in whose praise its members assembled. The Marzeah was also a group with strictly defined membership criteria. Sometimes it included holders of similar functions or offices, like priests of a given community, and membership was very likely hereditary. We find the names of several generations on the lists in Ugarit. Members of such a group, who, as already mentioned, managed common property and jointly undertook legal actions and acted officially as a group in contacts with authorities, like for instance, the king, and in cult-related circumstances, for instance, making offerings required by law. What is more, there were officially many such permanent and, as it seems, closed groups in any given community, which seem to enter into conflicts leading to court disputes from time to time. The application of the typologies of Grignon or Dickler to the realities of the Marzeah must raise doubts of the same nature as the objections to the very construction of the model or ideal type of this institution. However, the use of these typologies would allow us to view the Marzeah in a very interesting light. In Grignon's classification, the Marzeah would be a typical example of non-domestic banquet, and within this category it is, unlike the Symposium, an institutional banquet that does not thereby lose the qualities of a leisure feast. From a different viewpoint, it can be classified as an example of exceptional commensality taking place on clearly defined festive days, whereas in Symposium can accompany a festival of a small or large community. It may also convene without a specific occasion. The Marzeah is also an example of a so-called segregative or exclusive feast. For understanding of the institution of the Symposium, it is crucial to realize its somewhat paradoxical nature, a segregative banquet that integrated individuals who had previously been social outsiders, as I mentioned, the nouveau riche of a given community, as I already mentioned. On the grounds of the theories of Dittler and Hayden, the Marzeah would undoubtedly be a diacritical or distinctive banquet, which is well accentuated by the fact that the commensal group had a separate house or rooms in which they regularly conducted their meetings. Likewise, the group had a separate autonomous treasury. Importantly, an ordinary sympotic group in Greece usually had neither of these as far as we know. Setting aside the typologies of Grignon and Dittler, let me note that unlike the Symposium, the Marzeah did not entail a strict equality between the members of the group, its diacritical nature notwithstanding. The latter seems to have been acutely hierarchical, reflecting the actual relations of power and prestige in a given community. If we add that membership of the group was hereditary, then the most important features of the Symposium will turn out to be absent. It was also not a dynamic occasion for the integration or negative selection of members of the local elites, or a situation radically detached from the world of everyday social, political, and economic relationships. Furthermore, it was not an occasion, and I will repeat myself from the beginning of this paper, it was not an occasion in which fragile hierarchies formed ad hoc based on conventional symbolic grounds, usually through rivalry in cultural skills. Now, if we compare the Symposium to its closest Levantine counterpart, the feast of Samson in Judges, we will clearly see how far-reaching the differences between the two really are. During the 7-day feast, the biblical hero hopes to defeat the 30 young Philistines with the power of his riddle. However, in striking contrast with the Symposium's rules of the game, the prize in this competition is not a conventional symbol of prestigious victory, like in Greek Symposium, such as some sweets, a cup of wine, or even kisses by some of the fellow banqueter, but a very specific material game, 30 linen garments and 30 festal garments, end quote. All the above discussed functional and structural differences between the Marzeah and the Symposium by no means decrease, of course, the likelihood that before the age of the Cup of Nestor, the Greeks drew inspiration from certain commensal customs they considered appealing, ones they experienced firsthand in the Middle East or only learned about indirectly. But due to these differences, however, the theories that consider such inspirations as a decisive factor in the formation of the Symposium cease to be self-evident to my mind. I would venture to conclude that none of the constitutive traits of the Marzeah directly correspond to any of the constitutive traits of the Symposium, and the similarities between the two are limited to, I think, rather secondary phenomena. In this situation, it is not enough to prove the possibility of a commensal cultural transfer between the Aegean and Levant in the 9th or 8th century BCE, as some scholars looking for Western iconographical testimonies to the reclining banquet have done. Now, scholars arguing in favor of the decisive influence of the Marzeah on the Greek Symposium sometimes consider such a hypothetical cultural transfer as parallel to the adoption by the Greeks of the alphabetical scripts from the Levant. This is one possible cultural model for this transfer, possible transfer. I, for my part, would suggest another possible model. I would compare the relationship between the Levantine feast and the Symposium to yet another well-known phenomenon. The great archaeologist, German archaeologist Hans-Georg Niemeyer pointed out that Phoenician colonization preceded the Greek colonization by about 2 centuries, which leads one to suspect that when the Greeks undertook their overseas travels, they were following the Phoenician example, with which they were familiar. At the same time, Niemeyer stressed that the modern historian requires 2 completely different explanatory models in order to understand these 2 migrations. The 2 colonizations exhibit clear differences, which most likely resulted from the dissimilar conditions and motifs of the overall overseas expansion of these 2 groups. Niemeyer's thought was then developed by Jan Paul Krillard, who emphasized fundamental differences between the social, political, and cultural characteristics of early Greece, more specifically the Euboean milieu and early Iron Age Phoenicia. I find this example very instructive. Unlike the adoption of a specific set of technical skills, when they borrowed the alphabetical script from the Levant, although this did not necessarily happen on Levantine soil, it is difficult to seriously consider that Phoenicia provided substantial inspiration or had decisive influence on Greek civilization, I think. Even taking into account the chronological relationship and overall similarity, as well as partial geographical overlap of both colonizations. In that case, the key differences lay in social structures, relations of power, and finally, the economic models of the Greek and Phoenician worlds. Even if we were able to definitely confirm the influence of the Near Eastern Marzeah on the complex social institution of the Symposium, and it is possible, of course, it is even perhaps likely, in order to explain the origins of the Greek aristocratic banquet, we would rather have to focus on the underlying internal determinants of the Greek, or more specifically Aegean, background in which it took shape. Sorry for being so quick with my paper. Thank you so much.